Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Get Out of Rap. I'm really pleased today to be joined by Chris de Souza, who is the Director of Business Consulting at CGI. And it's testament to the relationships that this podcast allows me to build. But myself and Chris have spoken about doing this for a couple of years, I think now. Chris, obviously something got in the way. But I'm really pleased we're able to do this. Thanks very much.
Hi, Martin. Yeah, delighted to be able to join you.
We did start talking about you coming on, didn't we? I know we met in London.
Goodness me,
Um,
it was. I reckon it was about 3 years ago, maybe 2 or 3
yeah,
years ago. We thought we talked about this, and then, as you say, there's something occurred in 2020 which sort of put pay to that. But yeah, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to join you and talk about stuff that's really close to my heart. You know, that sort of contact center world.
yes. Well, it's obvious from anyone that knows you and sees how you show up on LinkedIn. You're evangelical about our industry and the good that's in it. So perfect for Get Out of Rap. But let's take you right back then. Where did the journey start for you, Chris?
I fell into contact centres and customer service, I suppose, back in, I think I was a 26-year-old naive chap up in Manchester, and I joined a company called Baines and Ernst, which was a financial management company. There was about 8 or 9 people in the business, and it was a tiny little operation. Not really sure anyone really knew where it was going, but proper baptism of fire, Martin. We grew that business from the 8 or 9 people, as I say, when I joined, to 2,000 people in 2 years.
Wow.
So I gained my entrepreneurial stripes, shall we say, when I worked there. So I looked after the back end of the business, operationally, customer service, and things like paralegal, and did a bit of IT as well, which is where I really got that sort of knowledge about how phone systems and telephony really work. From there, I moved to South Africa. I set up a contact center there, which was an outbound sales contact center. Again, hugely fascinating seeing a different culture and how a business can evolve with, different people. And contact centers over in South Africa were, that's what I say. It's contact centers. I mean, outsourced contact centers over there were essentially non-existent. So obviously, they had their own internal ones. So we came over there and we sort of showed what a new industry could look like. And I think, as they say, the rest is history with many operations over there. And from there, came back to the UK. I found it a little bit dangerous over in South Africa, if I'm honest with you. Came back over here, uh, moved to London, worked essentially for the next few years looking at ground transportation. So working in the minicab industry, looking after their customer service for Addison Lee. And then I moved to look after Boris Bikes, which was an amazing experience working with Transport for London and working with what was a really iconic line of business. Everybody knows the Boris Bikes, and it was fun. And one of the things I suppose that we really did there was, and I said to the guys, look, this is we're not selling life insurance. We're not this. Yes, it's an important job to do. We need to look after our customers. It is Transport for London after all. However, it's a fun thing, and let's treat it like a fun thing. So, we developed an amazing team there, and it was a testament to the achievements we got. We were top performing contact centre for a number of years for Transport for London. We got ourselves in the top 50 contact centres. But the thing that I'm probably most proud of that team was the engagement that we had. So we went from perhaps not the best place when I joined to the top performing, most engaged team for Serco, which was the company that operated the Boris Bikes. They had 130,000 employees across the globe, and our little operation, performed the best. But that was down to the people, the attitude that we instilled. Absolutely phenomenal. And then moving into real corporate territory with Mastercard, start developing a global reach, working across a number of different lines of business. Met some great folks there as well. And then now I find myself probably the job which I'm saying to people, the job I've probably worked for my entire career is working at CGI, which gives me, I think, an opportunity not only to sort of do what I'm paid to do, is sort of contact center consultancy, but also work with folks in contact centers to try and shape our industry and really understand where we're going. And that's something which I'm so so passionate about, as you said in the introduction. Contact centers. Sometimes people say, "How can you be so excited about contact centers, Chris?" My uncle, he still says to me, "When am I going to get a proper job?" But I absolutely love it, and I think the backbone to what we do in this country is all around customer service, great customer experience. If we get that right, it's a golden opportunity. So yeah, that's me potted history there, Martin.
There is so much that what a storied career. There's so much to love about that. There's a couple of things I just wanted to ask you about actually. So that kind of, right back with Baines and Ernst, that kind of phenomenal growth in a very short period, it kind of like hold on tight, right? Kind of hands. What did that teach you? What would you say to people who might be listening that are either going to be stewarding that or just within a company that goes through that much growth? What's the good, the bad, and the ugly?
The hard part is resilience, because you are, as you say, you're hanging on by the seat of your pants, particularly when you're getting into management. You're growing that fast, where you're sailing into real uncharted territory, and that's what we were doing. The financial management industry was very much in its infancy when I was there, and regulation, there wasn't any, and we were operating the business. We'd come up with ideas, let's go and do it. So things like governance were kind of not so much. It's probably the best way to put it. But then you start thinking about it. You're dealing with your consumers' money, and as we grew, as we got bigger, people started to notice you as a business, and we ended up on Watchdog, and it was, again, that was a baptism of fire, because whilst we were convinced and happy that we hadn't done anything wrong, it's a story, it was out there. Now, interestingly enough, Watchdog played our television adverts at prime time on BBC television, and we made a lot of new business off the back of people seeing that. So, but again, you have to learn fast, and I had to cut my teeth and start to try and learn resilience, and arguably wasn't the best at it because I was a young chap at the time. This is the first time I'm in business. I'm in a quasi directorial role, and you've got to be able to think on your feet, and it's like get stuff done and make decisions and not be afraid to make decisions. I think is the key message that I found there. But then, from a satisfaction perspective, to see something which you've got your hand in and actually grow, and see it from remembering the days when, I sat in that little room with 8 other people, to having 2 sites, 2 big buildings with and we created a buzz within that organisation. So it was phenomenally exciting.
Yeah, I love that.
So lots of positives, but yeah, as you say, it was that roller coaster, and you couldn't put your hands out to wave because you were hanging on for dear life.
Yeah. And then quite early on, I guess, exposure to working in a different culture. And I think people know this by now. I did that, and it made me, I would say, it's probably had the biggest impact on my career, working in a foreign land, learning everything, kind of getting involved. What was, if you can sort of summarize it, that like for somebody still early on in their career when you went to South Africa?
I think I learned so much about people, and also, see, the South African culture when I was over there was probably what I would suggest what we were like a few years ago. That sort of respect. The agent would call me sir, and I said, "No, it's Chris. It's Chris. Don't worry. Don't, sir." And there was that sort of very much sort of hierarchical, formal way of talking to you. And at the same time, of course, remember, South Africa was not long out of coming out of apartheid. It was only 5 or 6 years, I think, when I was there. So there was still that slight uneasiness, and as you sort of bringing people together, it was challenging, and of course you've got the rules that the government were bringing in and were changing continuously about the order in which you could employ people, for example. So it was again, it's not so much the specifics to that, but again, it's learning to deal with yourself, learning to pick up on challenges and work through challenges in an environment which is different to what you're used to. So yeah, it was great, but difficult.
There's been some, it's kind of like some great chapters in your story, because then you go and, like you say, working with the iconic the bikes within London, and that just must have brought up all of its own challenges as well. Was that the first public sort of sector role?
Yes, and it was interesting because it had been set up with a lot of ideas about how to, because it's a public sector. It was a public sector operation. It was put into an area of London where there were some challenges as far as employment was concerned. So they tried to sort of use that to leverage getting people back into work. At the same time, they getting a good operation up and running, what had been a challenge for them. But what you then recognise, and this is again where I really was able to put one of my passions about employee engagement really into play, was really trying to understand what the people who are working there wanted out of a job. Right, so it's very easy. We've all seen the stereotypical contact centre where someone's walking around with the sort of quasar stick saying, work harder, we've got calls waiting, etc. Well, actually that's not what motivates people. And we're trying to recognise the specific people who were working in that contact centre. And of course, everybody's different. Everyone's got different things in their lives which they're trying to work through. Getting those guys to what was the touch points for individuals to want to deliver the kind of service that we really wanted to give. And I always remember sitting there when I first joined the business. They had, you get in the large companies, you get these strap lines, and one of them, which I forget the rest of, if I'm honest with you, one of them was foster an entrepreneurial spirit, and that was put everywhere around our contact centre. And I remember looking at that one day and I said, what does that actually mean to a contact centre agent? You come into work, you're going to deal with people, and bear in mind, people are not calling contact centres because they want to tell you what a lovely day they've had, what a fabulous ride around Hyde Park, right? They're calling because something's wrong, something's annoyed them, and they want to let off steam and have something dealt with. And then telling the agent you need to have an entrepreneurial spirit just doesn't resonate with anyone, frankly.
Well, isn't it funny? You've made such a good point, because if you try and it doesn't add up to how their life goes, or how the work is. I mean, so it's kind of like, have an entrepreneurial spirit, but if you're 1 minute late back from your toilet break, you're going to be, we're watching you, and I'm sure things have, I know things have changed, but it's a really good point to say the kind of values and the things that mean something to your team don't necessarily, there's a disconnect there, isn't there, between kind of have this entrepreneurial spirit, but you are, so unfortunately your role is very, very scrutinized, so and defined, quite narrow parameters, isn't it?
Well, that was the interesting part, you see, because and again there was a, again, I'll get some of the numbers wrong here because it was a little while ago, but there was a one of the processes that was involved in that contact centre was people would call up because they had made a payment on one of the terminals, and they needed a refund because something hadn't quite worked out. Fair enough. And the process was that the person who took the call would then fill out some kind of form, and it went off to another person, it went off to another person, and eventually the £1 that needed to be refunded was sent back. And I kind of costed it out as to how much I felt that was costing the business. And it was a lot of money, right? But more importantly, I thought about the message it was saying to the agent who was talking to that customer, right? Essentially, if I strip that all the way back, what we're really saying is, we don't trust you with a pound, right? And
Yeah.
you know, what could possibly go wrong is the answer to that. So I looked at that, and we talked it through. We looked at the processes and thought, yeah, okay, you do the risk assessment on all these things, and I said, look, let's just give everyone a floor limit, so to speak, as to what you can and can't refund. And we did that. But the impact that had on the motivation and the engagement is by saying, look, guys, get on with it. Trust you. Why do I need you to process £1 in such a way? And that was kind of the thing that we did throughout throughout the life of that operation, is trust our agents, trust the people who are working, colleagues actually. Let's call them agents, our colleagues, and get them involved in the business. I'll give you another example of what we did there. We looked at when important people came to visit us. Right, so we could have directors, we could have people quite high up in Transport for London. And I said, well, what if? Because what normally happens is when these people turn up, if we're not repainting the office, I'm joking,
Yeah.
all the big wigs turn up, we all put our suits on and our ties, and we walk around and show you all the best bits, don't we? And I said, well, actually, let's get our agents involved. And we had like a little bit of a rota, and said, look, who wants to show this person around? And we won't come with you as managers, right? You go and you show us what you want in that contact centre. And that's what we did. And people loved that. They were getting involved in a little bit of the management. They were showing that they were important, and they were as important as anybody else. So it was little things like that which empowered and drove that engagement up. And hey, guess what happened? They started doing amazing customer service, right? So
I love that. I love that. It's kind of the whole point of empowerment, and there's a common thread to. Sorry about that as well. I just had to let my dog out. He was going to chew through wires that might have stopped our recording. But it's about empowerment, and it's about you mentioned something earlier, taking the time and putting in the work to get to know your team,
yeah,
and appreciating. Guess what? They are smart people, and if you empower them and trust them, that what a powerful story as well. One, they're not trusted with £1.
yeah. The interesting thing about our industry, if you think about it, is, and I think it's again, I've not worked in other industries, but I figure that our industry is quite unique in the way that we get to be managers and we get to be leaders, because most of us and most people I talk to who are in leadership positions within the contact center world have started at the agent level or started somewhere around at that level and have worked their way up. And from a career perspective, if you want to do that and you want to develop a good career in customer experience, customer service, whatever we choose to call it, I think I think there's something quite unique about our world.
100%.
And because the people who generally are leading contact centers have got the battle scars, we can empathize, but it's important we then choose to empathize and not forget that journey that we've taken to get to where we are. Really important, that I think, in my mind.
100% agree, massively so, because it's often, you can see, can't you, sometimes people that have gone up through the ranks actually do forget and do still enforce some weirdly draconian type rules, when allow your team to flourish and see what's possible, because we should have more of us that have kind of gone through the ranks. It always seems to me that that's a fundamental message that we don't always preach enough of, that for agents, you can be saying your career starts here.
Yeah.
This is it. This is the start of what could be a fantastic career. Don't necessarily think about the day to day. Do your best at it, excel at it, but this is the starting point. You could go this direction, that direction. You could go anywhere. It's quicker than you would do in another industry. It's a massive, massive positive for us, but we still don't push it enough, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, again, back in the cycle hire days, I was thinking once about what, because again, we have this thing, don't we? We want people to do well. You try and figure out what's the thing that's going to motivate folks to do it, right? And again, putting that idea of career right at the front of mind, and we would fluctuate the numbers that we would have. We'd always take an extra bunch of folks on for the summer because obviously summer more people are cycling, more calls, right? Lots of tourists. So, we put an advert out there and we get lots of CVs. And I started looking, when I looked at the CVs, there was a particular operation, which I shan't name, where they weren't treated right and that contact centre wasn't particularly good. Therefore, the agents um, they weren't customer focused enough for what I was looking for. So when I looked at the CV, if they had that contact centre on it, I would essentially automatically discount them. But then I thought, what about if we flip that on its head, right? And we say, if I got a CV with a particular contact center or a particular operation, I'm more likely to want those agents to work for me. I thought, well, that's what we create with our contact center at Cycle Hire. So essentially, that's the message that I put out there for our guys, right? Let's develop this into an award-winning, state of our best practice contact center, so that if you decide that you wanted to move on, people will look at your CV and go, "Oh, you worked there. I know you was something special about you, right?"
Yeah.
Funnily enough, people didn't want to leave when we got to that point. So, I mean, one of the things which I'm really, really proud of is, in a kind of strange ways, that we were given lots of notice that our contact center was going to close. They were going to, for financial reasons, it was going to move to Scotland, and we were given around about a year's notice that was going to occur. But the pride that the team had, that nobody left. The
Wow.
last day was essentially all the people that were there when we were told we were going to close. So it's that kind of stuff which you've done something right.
Yes.
When you get that, I mean, also even the stuff that you talk about measuring people and sort of watching them closely. I scratch my head sometimes when I think about the things that we deem as important as contact center leaders. You think about the first thing that people ask when you walk in. What was the service level yesterday? Well, 80/20. Why did we? And I think, well, why do we ask that as our first question,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Why do we ask, how were our customers? How did we do dealing with our customers? How did we do giving them excellent service yesterday? Like, that should be the measurement, surely. That's more important than whether or not we hit that 80/20. And let's face it, there's so many businesses, particularly through the pandemic, that came nowhere close to it, right? But they still ask that question and they still panic and put that justification up the line to say, we didn't hit that number because of this and this, and we had this many calls over delivered, blah blah blah. And you go, that's not what we worry about, you know.
We are so similar because um, there's a couple of contact centers I worked in where um, some of the directors were like a force of nature. They would just like charge across the contact center sort of floor, and invariably would shout over something about a KPI. And I was more interested in my people and how the calls were going, how people were feeling, both our teams and the customers. And yeah, fine, you can have that wrapped up in numbers, but some of the more traditional stats, let's say, such as service level, yeah, I paid them a cursory glance, but they weren't things that were top of my mind. And I found myself a couple of times just shouting out a number that I knew was acceptable, and that ended up with a thumbs up, and the person kind of carried on. And once as well, we just thought I don't know if I should be admitting this, but once we thought we would test something, and it was about a plasma that sat outside one of our director's offices, who he was obsessed with availability and colors, and he knew what's, green and then I think it was orange were good because there were people available, but there were also lots of people talking. When we had a particularly nice moment, we did a screenshot and just stuck that up on the plasma.
Brilliant.
Stuck that on the plasma for the day, because we knew what we were doing. We had a good team, and like you, the buzz, if you want to say in inverted commas, it's a phrase you mentioned a few times, is so important, isn't it?
Yeah. And that I think is really, it's interesting as to where we go now, because obviously we've got a lot of people in our industry working from home. We
Mm.
talk a lot at the moment about hybrid working and this idea that a contact center is going to be at least some of the time people working from home. And I kind of think about the practicalities behind that because, I mean, aside from the fact that most people have taken their tower and their screen and their keyboards on a taxi or in the bus home, and what are they going to bring that back? Or are they going to backwards and forwards with it? Are we going to give them all laptops? You then have to think about the connectivity to systems. Domestic broadband isn't the same as the broadband we get or the connectivity we get in an office. But I think equally there's that buzz that we've just spoken about, the engagement that you have, the social element. People who work in contact centres are social animals, I think it's fair to say. We thrive
Yeah.
off that, interaction with others, and also the support side to it. I said earlier that people don't generally phone contact centres because they just want to say what a lovely day it is. There's a problem often. And, when if depending on the business that you're working in, if you've come off a shift or you're going through the day and someone is, unfortunately, reality, people get abusive, people are not pleasant on the phones.
Mm.
Who do you turn around to just offload or get that support? Well-being cannot underplay that in our industry. Cannot underplay it at all. It goes with engagement, and we need to look after our agents. We need to make sure they're supported. And when when they're sitting at home and they might be sitting at their kitchen table, I'm lucky. I've got my office space which I've done out with screens and all this good stuff. But if you haven't got the luxury of that and you're having to set your computer up on your kitchen table, work for a few hours, might be competing with other people working from home, or you've got a
Hog.
dog, exactly, whatever. It's not easy. And I saw something in one of the newspapers only this weekend where it's being suggested now that that lovely veneer of home working is starting to wear off, and where we saw this peak in productivity shortly after everyone went home, that productivity is starting to wane a little.
As
So
our, absence, sorry, absence and attrition stats are now starting to go back up.
yes,
Mm.
so with all that in mind, I do wonder whether we will end up hybrid working, or whether we will at some stage migrate back to the contact center environment. And let's face it, it's a great environment to be in. So, I kind of hope it does, but we'll see. I think on the flip side, the hybrid working approach does open up opportunity for people who can't traditionally work in a contact center or travel to an office. So if you're a parent who has to drop the kids at school, then come and do a few hours and then go and pick them up again, or then work into the evening. There's opportunity there. So I don't think it's a brush that we can paint across everything, but I'm not sure that this idea that we're going to not have contact centres anymore is realistic.
I would agree, and I guess my hope is, because you're right, the working from home model allowed us to tap into a talent pool that probably felt marginalized and wasn't able to do this kind of work. Lots of different groups fall within that category, I think, and they've now been incorporated into our world, and we benefit as a result. Um, but like you, I'm fascinated actually by, there must be quite a high percentage now in our industry for the first time who have not experienced that.
Yeah, I know what you're going to say.
The thing that's probably is the most significant factor in me staying in this industry and yourself was that buzz, working in amongst lots of people, having a laugh, feeling like you're committed and part of a team, the highs, the lows, who haven't had any experience of that. I'd love to look at that in more detail.
How do you get the culture, the business culture?
Mm.
If you've never, there's people who have joined businesses who have never even, face to face met their managers. They've never been to the office, which is fair enough. We understand why that is, but
Mm.
I don't think it's a sustainable model.
Mm. And where does that where does being able to be there for the customer, when you think about the future and what's changing with employees, what's changing with technology, what's changing with customer behavior, and where we are at with being able to deliver the kind of levels of customer experience and service that we all want to deliver, the future's exciting, but also there's lots of possibilities there as well. And I know it's something you have some views on in terms of how we should be set up as an industry, what we should be focusing on.
Yeah, I do, and it worries me sometimes about some of the things I hear. So, ultimately, in my view, we are a business has a customer, and we've got to put that customer right at the front of our minds because these ultimately the people that pay our wages, right? The problem is that then we layer on top of all these ideas that seem to morph themselves to be and called something different every time we discuss it. So, I remember not long ago, omni-channel was the thing. Then we started calling it multi-channel, which is the same as omni-channel. And then we have a thing called digital transformation, which for the life of me, I don't understand what's different from that to omni-channel at the start, right? Um, and also, what I think about a lot at the moment is whilst we go down that route, and I've heard folks talking about call deflection, which is a term I fundamentally disagree with. Because I think if you're going to start talking call deflection, I can do that really easily. We'll just put a message on the IVR to say, sorry, we don't want to talk to you. Please go on our website. That will deflect all your calls, right? And it'll
Yeah,
have much the
job
same
done.
job done. Yeah. What I think we have to do is think about the customer, and at the same time look at all the different channels. And yes, quite right. There are different people who like to use different channels. We've got choice, but the key word there is choice, rather than this idea where we're driving people down a particular route because that suits us from a financial or company basis, right? And it was interesting that I put a post on LinkedIn, and I just kind of mentioned this as an idea, as a concept, and I got somebody who was quite famous in the 70s and 80s. Actually, he was a DJ on Capital and Radio One, and he responded back, and he was quite cutting about the whole contact center customer service industry. And he said something along the lines that what people want is what they wanted 50 years ago, which was when they have a problem, they can call someone up and that person knows what they're talking about and gives them the answer, and they don't have to sit on the waiting for someone to answer. Which, from a conceptual perspective, he's right, actually.
Yeah.
And there was a study that BT did not that long ago where 77% of people said they would like a phone number to be front and center on websites and on the app. And the majority of people that are calling, actually, we all think it's the older generation that uses this. 24 to 35 is the highest number, the highest demographic of people who actually call contact centers. We've got this idea that, oh yeah, everyone's gone onto social media and people don't. Yes, people do use social media to complain. And is that because we've left them no other option? So they get to the point of making that complaint because they're frustrated, and that's the only avenue. So they see it as an opportunity to shout about an issue that's occurred. But why do we want them to get to that point? My view is, let's deal with the problem. If someone wants to use live chat, let's make sure it works. If they want to use self-service within the IVR, let's make sure it works. If they want to call, and I would suggest that if you have your other channels that work efficiently, that you don't phone up. We've all got we all could all imagine the IVR voice recognition. I'd like to speak to Martin. Is that a Martian? No, Martin.
Yeah.
It
Well,
doesn't, and you start shouting at a computer because it's not getting
yeah.
it. If you're going to do that, make it work. And I chuckle with colleagues sometimes, and I say to them, look, again, I won't mention names, but I could list some of these that have been implemented, and it's not only the fact they don't work. Someone sat there, in a operational management meeting, and they go, right, let's just see what we've built. We've tried it out. Yeah, we'll sign that off. It's that'll do attitude, which I don't think fits within. our industry. You know,
Do you think then is it keep the customer front and center,
absolutely,
and then give them choice, but then deliver the services simply?
yes. If the thing that you're doing works, it will, people either don't need to call you, or if they, when they do call you, you provide them the service. I mean, there's a particular card that I use for when I go on holiday. They don't have a call center, right? But I'm prepared to put all my holiday money on this particular card, and I'll trust it to go abroad. And I've got two young children and a wife, and I've got to be able to feed them and pay the hotel bill, without any problems whatsoever. But I trust it because I know it works. They've built it so it works. So in the 5 or 6 years I've had this card, I've had no need to contact their customer service, or any kind of customer support from them. So you've got some choices there yourself. Create your product so it works. Don't compromise on it. Therefore, people are satisfied. It's where we start building things that don't quite work, and we go, all right, and then when people need the support, we don't. It's not forthcoming, and this trend of hiding phone numbers, it's
Yeah,
it
it's
just I don't get it.
no, and it doesn't. I don't. I think you're dead right in that we should be harder on ourselves and scrutinize ourselves as an industry more so than people not within the industry. And for me, one of the litmus tests is like, I know personally I've got to do something with my car insurance, and even just thinking about it then to make this to talk to say that sentence kind of just kind of, I sighed a bit because I know it's going to be a mental and verbal assault course. It's gonna. I'm prepared. My expectations are low. I know my effort's going to be high, and I think isn't that a shame that we can't. We have to kind of just for a moment we can still reward each other and recognize really talented people and teams, but we need to put that aside and just say we must do better. We've got to.
Yeah, and I think that the thing is that we are asking our customers to compromise too much, and we shouldn't be doing that. People's expectations sort of have kind of fallen, I think, over the years, particularly when, again, there are some great, and don't get me wrong, Martin, there are some really, really good outsourced contact centres out there, who do a really good job and have understood what it is to do good customer service. But then you've got some which have just been implemented because they're cheap. And so again, someone's made that calculation to go, well, you know what, it's cheap to do this, so we're prepared to have this much complaint rate, or essentially we're saying our customers are not as important as they think they are. And it's not a difficult thing to do. That's the part which I find difficult to reconcile. You can have a contact center overseas, have a contact center anywhere really, and it can do a great job, but you've just got to want to that contact center to do a great job, support it, help the people that are working there, treat them right, all the things we've talked about already during this conversation. Implement those wherever it is, but that idea that putting your customer first is the most important thing, because off the back of that, everything else falls into place. If you've got happy customers, you get less problems. Your happy customers is proven AHT is lower, right? We proved that in spades, but at Cycle Hire. We made the agents really happy. We had things like music playing in the contact center, believe it or not. We did that empowerment, so the agents were happy. We did a whole load of stuff with the IVR messaging, etc., which made the customer happy. So two lots of happy people interacting. We took our AHT down, believe it or not, from about 12 minutes to about 3.5 over that time. Which then has a knock-on effect as to, that uplift that we needed in the summer wasn't as much. Costs took control of themselves. But it's just turning that all around and looking at the whole picture holistically, rather than just going, well, you know what, it costs us this much to run this contact center, let's deflect some calls to save money.
What are your views on then you mentioned kind of happy employees. What part does their kind of well-being, mental health play in that?
It's absolutely key. It's key to your operation, and you know, I think where it's been a great thing over the last few years that the whole topic of mental health, particularly, has come to the forefront. I'm so happy that people no longer, we're not there yet, right? But
Mm.
the idea now and the way society is that we embrace people talking about mental health issues. We want to hear about it and we want to do something about it. It's no longer it's becoming less of a stigma, shall we say. As I say, I don't think we're there completely yet, but you know, making sure that you recognise, and I think it comes actually from knowing your people, knowing who you're working with. Again, always remember. I won't mention where this was, just from in case anyone recognises the story, but there were, when you walk into an office and people say, oh, hi, how are you? Yeah, great. It's that sort of that superficial, interaction. And I always remember this was just after the Christmas break, and I walked back into the office, and I always make an effort, always, by this point, I was really making an effort to know everyone and move away from that superficial conversation, but into a meaningful one. And I spoke to this colleague, and that person said to me, I said, "How are you? How was New Year?" "Yeah, great, fine." But because I knew that person, there was something not quite right. So I said, "Look, let's have a chat. So tell me what happened. What was it really like?" Took the time to have a conversation about that person's experience, but in depth. And it turned out they'd had a really bad New Year. They were not in a great place, but then we could, deploy the well-being policies and the people that we had on, on retainer to help that person. But unless you have those conversations and you actually just that stop and really look into what's going on with your team, you'll never know, because people, you know, again at that superficial level, will always just go, yeah, yeah, I'm fine, because that's just the way that we are, as the way we do interact. So yeah, well-being for me is, again, it's almost another tick in another sort of element. I was going to say tick in a box, but I don't mean that. Another element in looking after your team, engaging with your team, showing that you care.
Mm.
That they're important. And I think there's so many people. I've been on the wrong end of that in very early on in my career. Before I went to Baines and Ernst, I worked for someone who was just not pleasant, and I know what effect that had on me.
Mm.
I think negatively, very negatively at the start. Once you start thinking about that effect and how you as a leader can affect people, and I will absolutely be honest, I've got that wrong in the past. I know I have, and there's a lot of stuff I will regret, in the way that I've managed folks. But I've learnt from it, and I think where I am certainly, now having, as I say, had the battle scars and understanding what effect you as a leader can have on the people that you're working with, um, you've got the opportunity to make a real difference. But you've got to care, Martin. You've really got to
Yeah,
care.
I love that. I love that. And I think there's such a key message in what you said around going past the patterns of conversation so that you really can understand where your team are at. And I think if you're managing a team or you're managing team leaders, if you haven't yet got it, build in the time into your week that allows you to just sit with a team leader and say, tell me about the people in your team. Not necessarily, I don't want to be bombarded with stats. I just want to know, how is Chris? How is Martin?
Yeah.
Tell me where they're at. Tell me what's going on. And if there's a gap there that your team leader can't do that, then you need to support them and the environment to ensure that they can spend the time to understand how people are, what they're doing. And some weeks it might be it might genuinely be, yeah, yeah, all's good. Other other weeks it might not, but at least you have the routines in place that give you the time and space to do that, right?
Think about the number of times that, as a leader, one has you have a one-to-one booked, right, and then the one-to-one gets cancelled or moved because something else has come along, right.
Mm,
Think of the message that sends to the person whose one-to-one it is, because that
mm,
one-to-one is their special time. If you've got it right and if you've positioned it correctly, that one-to-one is that special time, the time for which is solely about them, and it's about them and the company and you. And then something more important comes along and you move it. That message is completely incorrect. And again,
mm.
didn't always get that right, but in recent years, if I put a one-to-one in, it's got to be critical, absolutely
Mm.
critical for that one-to-one not to occur when we said we were going to do it. And that's a simple thing. You might think that's obvious, but you know, folks who are listening to this, ask yourself that question: How many times do I move a one-to-one? You know, and
It's
what
a
impact does that have?
it's a fantastic question because anecdotally, I speak to, as I'm sure you do as well, speak to lots of people in the industry, and the first few things that are thrown out when the chips are down, and sometimes becomes very, very common, coaching sessions, feedback, one-to-ones, all gone instantly
Mm.
because of call volumes, and then that just becomes the norm. So then the moment you've missed a few, how effective is the next one when you do get together? Far less effective. You've got loads to catch up on, things are out of date, you feel rushed. And I do wonder, it would be great. We survey our industry a lot, don't we? But I do wonder the actual level, hand on heart, the contact centers that can say it's a 3-line whip. We never cancel a one-to-one or a coaching session. They're sacrosanct. They won't
Yeah,
move. Versus, oh yeah, they get cancelled all the time.
yeah. And I think we both know
Yeah,
which one's going to
I
win that
know.
one.
Yeah, I know where
Yeah,
my money might be. But we've got to do something about that. I mean, we've got to do something about that. It's how do we ask people to deliver their best, like you say, for the customer when we don't commit to their development and their progression and their well-being.
yeah, and I suppose the attitude we took at Cycle Hire and particularly was that you've got customer engagement is what we talk about a lot, but you've got colleague engagement. I think as is as important, and one drives the other if you think about it. You show that you care about the people that are delivering the service, they'll care back. It really is a two-way street. Yes, of course there are exceptions to that rule occasionally, but in the main, people who are highly engaged, people who are bought into what you're trying to do and the message you're trying to send, they'll deliver it in spades, and I've seen that. And also, when you're not engaged with something. Personally speaking, there'll be times when, in my career where I'm just not engaged with it, I don't feel it, and how your mind works.
Yeah,
You're not thinking about. You're thinking about, oh, that person, the way that person's just spoken to me, or the way that's where your mind wanders off to.
mm,
So yeah, it's as leaders within the contact center industry, and by leaders I mean anyone. All of us have got to
yeah,
really think carefully about this, because everything dovetails in each other. We talked about well-being, we talked about mental health. All have got an effect on each other, and you know, I firmly believe, simply because I've seen it, that get it right, and that your contact center operation can be the best place in the world. And I've seen it, I've lived it, and your customers experience it as well. It's just a well-rounded thing that's you can be proud of. And when I look back at some of the stuff that I've been privileged to have been part of, and I just think, wow, there's a story to tell. And I just sometimes when I see some of the stuff that goes on in our industry, I just think, why? Because we can do so much better.
mm. And it's not hard to get. It's well, I think this for me has kind of been really energizing and motivational to hear from you, Chris. And we definitely have to do it again. We only touched on so many different topics, but it's not difficult to get that your centre, whether it's a hybrid, remote, all in, to be an absolutely buzzing place, is it?
No, it's not, and it's fun. It's, from a satisfaction perspective. I love going. I love going into customer service operations. I love interacting with the people because they're a certain type of person as well, aren't they? They're
Yeah,
out there, and I've met some proper characters over the years, and you just go, wow, all the stuff we've done. And I said to you when we spoke a few weeks ago, Martin, I reckon there's a book somewhere. Maybe
yeah,
we should all collaborate. The contact center story or something like that, because
yeah.
it's really interesting. And people don't recognise it. I think people outside of the industry don't recognise the importance of it. And I think even joining the industry, as an agent, it's a good thing to do. Actually, it opens up such huge career opportunity.
100%.
Getting
Yeah.
yourself into a business you might be interested in, a particular industry. Everyone's got a customer of some nature,
Mm.
so it's a good foot in the door in
Yeah.
some respects to prove yourself. And I know lots and lots of people who started in the contact center world. Again, if I refer back to Transport for London and the cycle hire. I know lots of people who started off in the contact centre and moved into the operational side of things, into the performance management side. There's a whole load of opportunity within organisations getting through the door. So, you know, it's something that people should consider and not see it as a holding pattern before you do something else.
More power to you, Chris. Thanks so much for coming on. And we can't go without you showing your baseball cap.
Yeah, no, just a little advert here. I don't know if everyone knows that Martin does have a line of apparel for the contact center industry. So there we go. And I'm sure this
Look
will end
at
up as a
that.
thumbnail somewhere. But
It's going to 100%. That's the one. That's the image. Chris de Souza from CGI. It's been lovely chatting to you. I do genuinely feel motivated and positive about our industry. You've got you talk a lot of sense, and thanks very much for coming on.
absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, mate.